don't know, starting recording. Okay, so we have Shalem Sumanthiran here. He is a past alumni of Sri Lanka, Team Sri Lanka. He's also been a runner-up at WSDC, which is the year that it's held online. And he's also a judge at WSDC as well. And he agreed to conduct this workshop on behalf of the Debaters Council. So, Shalem, I think we can start. If you need anything, you can let me know.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, everyone. I recognize many names, so I think no need for like any lengthy introductions. So we can just get into it. Okay. So can everyone see? Can somebody confirm to me that they can see my screen? No need to hide the slides. Okay, great. So hopefully this will not take any longer than, or hopefully it'll take less than an hour, and then we can have room for questions at the end. And what I really want to do is identify some issues or maybe some pertinent questions that are particularly relevant for the Sri Lankan debating circuit. So at the beginning, I'll be going over the basics of judging as well, WSDC style judging, but I'm going to assume that everyone here is somewhat familiar with the format, they know the basic rules. And if you have any questions about that, we can answer them at the end. So there'll be, this is definitely catered more towards a Sri Lanka circuit specific kind of workshop, iron out some details, hopefully make things a little bit more consistent, so on and so forth. So what we'll cover today are these 6 things. Some of them we'll kind of skip over quite quickly, and some of them we'll spend more time on. Yeah, okay. So on the basics of judging, which we'll go over very quickly, I would first of all recommend everybody watch Sachin's briefing that happened a couple of weeks ago on BP judging, and the first, I would say, 40 minutes of that are almost directly applicable to WCC style judging. You want to be an average intelligent voter. You don't want to have any special knowledge about the particular motion that they have introduced. You want to be comparative when listening to and deciding the relevance and value of arguments in a debate. So that means when somebody gives you an argument, you want to evaluate it in the context of the debate by asking the question, how does this matter relative to what the other side has said about this? So if it is about benefit to a particular stakeholder, okay, what is the stakeholder otherwise going to benefit from or be harmed from when it comes to this motion? Has the other side given me an argument that I need to then consider in comparison? If they have not, is there a comparative of the status quo that I need to consider compared to what prop is telling me I should believe, so on and so forth. So you need to be very comparative. What we mean when we say credit arguments carefully here is you want to ask yourself, what has this team proven with respect to this particular debate? So more specifically, what does this motion require? And how does the team giving me this argument fulfill that need? So basically burdens. Has the team identified a particular burden? If they have not, is it reasonable that this argument is trying to fulfill a very obvious burden? So for example, if you want to this House would ban smoking, if the motion is this House would ban smoking and the proposition is trying to answer the question, it's trying to say we should ban smoking because it's harmful, have this clearly fulfill their burden of it is harmful enough to justify a ban or to meet the criteria for a ban. What is this criteria? Have they dated out? Have they met that criteria? These are the questions that you need to be asking as a judge as to whether or not the team has fulfilled that burden. So credit arguments very carefully when you hear arguments like this. When you're deliberating and thinking about who should be given more credit, these are the questions you should be asking. We'll get more into the specifics of this when we get to intervention, which, as you'll see, is point number 4. And weighing and comparing arguments, we will get to more specific questions and a bit more interesting questions about this. But for now, this is all I'm going to cover in when it comes to basics of judging. If there are more questions about this, again, let's cover them later. So first thing that I want to cover, which is a bit more particular to becoming a format of debate that is more consistent with WSDC format of debate. That is to say, we want the Sri Lankan circuit to start looking more and more like the WSDC circuit, more consistent with their judging metrics, their judging standards, their judging norms. And this includes speaker roles, specifically second and third speaker roles, because I think the way that we view them in Sri Lanka is a little bit different to the way that we view them in WSDC. First of all, second speaker extensions and arguments are not necessarily required. I don't think you should be having a list of, a checkbox of different things that that the second speaker has to do. And if they don't do one of these things, then automatically they get a lower score, right? Now, that might apply, for example, POIs. Second speakers probably, and third speakers and all speakers really should take a POI. But that is for a reason. It is for the reason that they need to engage with the other side. So really the reason that you are giving them less of a speaker score because they have not taken a POI is because they haven't engaged with the other side as well as they should have, and not as well as they had the opportunity to. So similarly, there is a good reason why certain speakers might not have a unique argument or unique extension. If their speech is not a repetition of the first speech, they do not need to say, I have a completely new and independent contribution to the debate. Instead, I'm going to engage in particular kinds of extension of arguments that have already been made. I'm going to do more weighing. I'm going to do this kind of rebuttal. As long as they contribute in the debate in some way, this is fair and this is perfectly valid and reasonable. And they should not be penalized because they do not have an extension. We'll get to what third speakers need to do and the difference between late and new material in a little bit. But extension versus new substantive, this is a slide that I've taken directly from the WSDC speaker, like judge briefing. And here they have explained in a little bit more detail that the norm for second speakers used to be to have unique independent arguments, but more recently, second speakers engage in extensive weighing, framing, rebuttal action, and advanced stakeholder analysis. No approach in itself is necessarily better than the other. Yeah. If the decision is made to forward a new argument, that argument should be given enough time to be properly and fully analyzed. So we'll get a little bit more into how we should deal with content, strategy, and style a bit later. But for now, when second speakers deliver an argument, if they have decided, okay, I definitely have a new extension to the debate, a new argument, completely new substantive, but I'm only going to give it 1 minute. This is something that you should penalize them for because they have not given enough time for a wholly new concept to be both introduced, well explained, and then made relevant in the debate. So therefore, they should be given less points because it's unstrategic. Again, all of these reasons that we are usually told should result in less points or something like this, it comes back to the same reason of it's not strategic or it is not particularly useful for the speaker to do this or not as engaging as they can be or some kind of reason like this, right? So as long as the second speaker is not just repeating the first speaker, all of this flies. More interesting is the difference between late and new material of third speakers. I just want to make the point that in WSDC, and there's a big difference that I used to see when I was debating, late content matters a lot more because oftentimes judges have a misperception that late content or just content that hasn't been said in the first and second speech, but is now being said in the third speech, is late content or new material, and therefore should not be credited in the debate. This is not true, but we need to be a little bit subtle and specific in how we understand what the difference between late material and new material is. So again, these are a couple of slides that I have, again, lifted directly from the WSDC briefing. So third speeches in WSDC may include a small part of their team's substantive case if flagged in the case division announced by the first speaker. So according to the rules of WSDC, actually, third speakers can even have a new argument as long as it is being flagged by the first speaker. And this is something that is never done because it's quite unstrategic, almost never done. But it does show that the bar for new material is a lot lower than we might assume. So the role of the third speaker is to respond to the other team's case, and responding covers direct rebuttal, weighing, new example, new ideas, logic, components of arguments, new lines of rebuttal. It is acceptable for third speakers to bring these new aspects into their speeches. Newness is not sufficient justification to discredit material at third. So when we look at this and we ask the question, does this make sense in the sense of now is it possible for a third prop or a third op to just come and give the whole case and win the debate on that basis, which is something that we sometimes might say? The answer to that is not really. It should be impossible for a third speaker to come up and give a whole new case that is a part of the substantive case, which is newness, or they give very important lines of analysis that has not been given before by the first and second speaker. But it should be impossible for them for 7 minutes to be able, in 7 minutes, to be able to deliver so much relevant content so late into the debate that it actually swings the debate in their favor. So basically, when we hear what might sound like new material in the third speech, we should still credit that argumentation with the understanding that as long as the other team responds adequately, and as long as the other team has done a sufficient job in their first and second speeches, that is not enough or should not be enough for the third speaker to single-handedly win the debate. The format works in the judge's favor in this instance. What is new material, right, is this extreme two that is on this slide of so much new analysis, barely allowing proper room to respond. So they basically, first speaker, second speaker flagged some concepts, some ideas. Third speaker then dumps like 6 mechanisms for each idea, or let's say 2 well-explained mechanisms for each idea. So one, opposition doesn't have a lot of time to respond, so you don't consider, you don't credit this argument as much as if it had come in the first and second speech. Secondly, again, the fact that the third speaker is basically doing all of the legwork means that they probably don't have enough time to develop all of these mechanisms and impacting and weighing. They can't do all of this in one speech. And so the argument doesn't even logically win them the debate, again, as long as the other team has done a good job in their first and second speech. So third speakers then need to have like this balancing act, and the role fulfillment for third speakers is only clearly fulfilled if the first and second speaker have done a good job, because only then do they have the time to take what has been said already and expand on it in a way that is strategic for the third speaker to do, i.e., impact it in a way that the second speaker has not done, and then weigh directly against the other team's arguments, to which they also respond. If the third speaker does all of this stuff, it should take them 8 minutes. If they do all of it well, it should take them 8 minutes. And it should achieve this balancing act of new analysis, new weighing, new examples, maybe, all of which is credited in the debate, which opposition, the other side, can respond to some extent, but also is not new material that should be discredited. Hopefully, I'm making sense here. It's a little bit subtle, but if there are very specific questions about this, again, we'll come to it later. Yeah, the general guide for how to evaluate a third speaker that is bringing up a lot of new content is if the response is successful, good content, but clearly this shows poor prioritization, so bad strategy. So the third speaker doesn't get, or we are just going to give them a 78 or 79 because they have all the good content in the debate. This is still poor strategy from the third speaker, and therefore they should be penalized in the strategy department. Generally, then the line at the bottom kind of summarizes it. Epiphanies are great, but you should have had them earlier. Okay, so that deals with the speaker roles section of this briefing. Of basically, in summary, no speaker has like a bunch of checkboxes that they have to fill. As long as they are doing their job in terms of like general role fulfillment, that's reasonable. Third speakers what they say should be taken into consideration is credited in the debate and should be credited and considered in the overall decision. But there is some bar for what is considered new material that is too late, but that bar is probably a lot lower than most people in the Sri Lankan debate circuit assume right now. We can be a little bit more lenient, and even being more lenient, it does not give third speakers an unfair advantage, or should not give third speakers an unfair advantage. Okay. Reply speeches. These should be tracked carefully. They are an important part of the debate. Most importantly, they can very easily swing rounds that are otherwise close. So if you're a judge and you're hearing like really good argumentation from one side and really bad argumentation from another side, then sure, the reply speech is not going to help you make a decision in any meaningful way. You should still track them, floor them, and give feedback about them after the debate. But if the two sides are actually quite close in terms of the level of content and strategy and style that they're providing to you, then the reply speech can have elements that will swing the round in one side's or the other's favor. What does this mean? New weighing of arguments, framing, contextual observations, or examples can all serve this function and are permitted and credited in replies. However, these need to be clearly derivative of the existing events in the debate. So again, the bar may be slightly lower than what we are used to, or maybe I haven't debated in like quite a long time in Sri Lanka, so I'm not up to date. But at least when I was debating, and from what I've seen judging recently, you can have all this stuff in replies, and they should be credited as long as the reply speaker is referring to something that's happened in the three substantive speeches earlier, and they can reference it directly. And if what they're saying is completely derivative of what has been said already, but is still introducing like a new perspective, an observation that hasn't been made, given that this stuff has been said already, for example, this is something that can be credited, should be credited, and clearly can swing the debate as long as it's done well and strategically. So obviously the bar for newness in reply speeches is a lot stricter than in third speeches, but all the stuff that was said before should still be considered. The caveat is that if third op brings in a lot of new material, prop reply can make that observation. Or they said this, we don't have the time to respond. They should have said this earlier. That's okay, but everything else is what was said before. Track them carefully. Incredibly important part of the debate, can swing close rounds, and should be scored appropriately as well. So in the Asian parliamentary scoring style, which I'll get to also in more detail later, that the average is at 37.5, which is half of the regular speech average of 75. And if you think they're particularly good reply speeches, you give them, 38.5, 30, even 39.5. So hopefully this is clear. Okay. We're going to move on to intervention now, where we're going to get into a little bit more of a subtle question of when judges should or can intervene in debates. So as has been pointed out in previous briefings, and something that hopefully all judges should know, is that judges are meant to be what's called non-interventionist. But you should be very careful in knowing what this means and where it can and cannot apply. It is impossible as a judge to never intervene in the debate, in any given debate. Some debates, you will not have to intervene at all. These are ideal. These are perfect scenarios. Many debates, you will have to intervene. That is there's something that was not said in the debate, but which should still be considered in this debate. But you should be very careful and very rigorous in choosing when it is justified to intervene. And if you choose to intervene in a debate in any way, the standard for what warrants this intervention should apply to both teams equally. And let me give a few illustrations of this. If two teams have both given some argumentation, but have done zero weighing, it's like the argumentation is completely parallel. They're just telling you reasons why something is true, and the other side is telling you reasons why something else is true. And both cannot be true at the same time. There is no weighing as to whether or not one thing is more true than the other. Then the judge needs to step in and say, first of all, this clash is the most important clash, even if the teams don't explicitly agree to this, because they spent the most time on it. This is one metric that you can use to justify intervention. Both teams clearly spend the most amount of their time on this particular issue. Clearly, then it is the most important question for both teams in this debate. Therefore, I'm going to say this is the most important clash, and whoever wins this probably wins the debate. Neither side has explicitly said this is the most important clash, and if you win this clash, you win the whole debate. This requires weighing across clashes. If they don't do this, the judge needs to step in and say, this is how I've justified stepping in time. Or the judge says, logically, this is what matters most in the debate. But again, you have to be very careful in who you are trying to be when you ask the question, this matters most. You are not asking that question as an individual. So if I'm judging a debate, it is not what matters most to Shalem. It is what would matter most to the average intelligent voter. This is the metric that you need to use to decide whether or not you are going to intervene and say this is the most important question in the debate. Again, if the teams have told you that something is the most important thing and given you reasons why, this is enough. Whenever you can justify not intervening, that is always the way to go. But when you are forced to intervene in order to give a decision one way or the other, the standard to do that needs to be from the perspective of the average intelligent voter and what you believe the average intelligent voter does care about. And this can be a little bit subjective, but as long as you can reasonably justify that this is what the average intelligent voter cares about, that's reasonable, that's fair. And this is why we have like panels of judges so that it gets averaged out. Another metric is like something is more, so one side may say something that is superficially true, but the judge knows that the other side is given reasons as to why something else is true also. And that is, and then the judge says, the other team has given me more reasons as to why it is more true, or it is better reasoned as to why their arguments are true. And so again, on a comparative basis, I'm going to give it to that side. The observation about applying similar standards to both teams is just to say that if you are going to say that one team has a piece of rebuttal, and this piece of rebuttal responds to like 3 different lines of argumentation from the other side, and you think that you need to make this observation for the team to be able to come to a decision, that is, the prop, for example, has not told you that this piece of rebuttal that they brought in prop 2 or prop 3 defeats 3 different lines of argumentation from op. But logically, it does. Prop hasn't told you this. But when you're deciding who's going to win the clash, you think that is a particularly important piece of rebuttal. And so you are going to then decide, right, this piece of rebuttal is important. I'm going to identify that it defeats all of these different lines of argumentation. This is something that we do implicitly, like it doesn't have to be so explicit. But if you're going to do that, then the same standard should be applied to the responses that were given by the opposition team. Did opposition give any response that logically also defeats multiple lines of argumentation from prop? They did not explicitly say so, but it seems quite self-apparent or quite evident, or at least as evident as the rebuttal that prop gave that you have decided defeats everything op says. So it is okay to intervene in these ways as well, as long as you're applying the same standard to both teams. Otherwise, you're being hypocritical and you're giving an unfair advantage to one team. And this is not fair. So let's look at what WSDC says about weighing issues. You must identify issues that are discussed in the debate in a systematic manner. Issues are often questions that help you decide whether a motion should pass. What are the main issues in debate? So first of all, what is most discussed? Issues that are more crucial to winning the debate than others. So logically, or what the average intelligent voter cares about more. How do you identify? One, debaters do it for you. If they do this for you, you don't have to do it yourself. If there's no clash, you've tracked and evaluated the arguments, and you've decided then that it is most reasonable that these are the big clashes. Yeah. Importantly, you cannot say these are the issues that should have emerged. Rather, you look at the issues that did emerge, and you may have to make a call as to what was more important. But this is intervention that is probably never justified. Saying this is an issue that should have come up. This is a question that you should have asked. This is a clash that should have been had in the debate, but was not brought up by this side, and therefore I'm going to penalize you. This is not fair. What was said in the debate, given what was said in the debate, I'm going to make a decision as to who wins. You're still following this basic standard, so it's fair. How do you decide these things? And we go back to the same question that was brought up when I said you need to credit arguments carefully. What is the motion require teams to prove? What were or became the most important issues, and who won these effectively through arguments and evidence provided? Hopefully this is clear. When you weigh issues, what did teams explicitly agree on is important. If that's not clear, then what did teams implicitly agree on is important. So you might have to read into it a little bit. But again, as long as it's reasonable, as long as you're applying the same standard to both teams, that's fine. And oftentimes it's actually very clear. They've just spent the most time on it. They both have clashes based on it, so on and so forth. If that's also not clear, then the reasons given by teams on why a particular issue matters more than the other issues. You are doing the weighing there. They have done the weighing for you. If they have not done the weighing for you, there's no explicit weighing, only then you enter the debate to decide the ranking of issues, not as your personal self, but as the average reasonable person. And then you can apply your own weighing metrics, size of the group, extent of the impact, so on and so forth. And then you decide who wins the issues and therefore the debate. So hopefully this is clear. It is subtle. It is something that you have to be rigorous and very careful when making your deliberation, when deciding who's going to win. But it is okay to intervene in some circumstances, and it is okay for your own subjective biases or interpretations to creep into the debate, as long as you're being very careful in how you have applied these biases. Have you applied them to both teams? And it's not your personal biases per se, it is what you think your interpretation of what the average intelligent voter or average reasonable person is. Okay. Speaker scores. There's really only one main point here, which is that we encourage judges to use the full range of speaker scores. We want to see high speaker scores if the debater has genuinely given an extremely good speech. And we are okay with seeing very low speaker scores if you think the debater has given an extremely bad speech. Both of these are fine. And both of these, we would encourage that judges use the full range of speaker scores. Importantly, and something that is not credited as much as it should be credited, at least in the Sri Lankan circuit, is style. And we'll get to more specific crediting of style later, but style definitely matters. And I'm going to pause here for a little bit to ask a question about, I'm not sure if everyone got the link actually, but we want judges who don't have a strong sense or strong metric as to what are good speeches and what are really good speeches or what are really bad speeches to maybe watch a few speeches to get an idea. So I think there was a link sent out to the semifinals of the 2021 WSDC, Canada versus Singapore. Did anybody you can write in chat or something, or you can even unmute. Did anybody get a chance to watch that debate? Did anyone get the link actually? not sure if
Shalem, the link was in the registration form, so everybody had access to it.
all right, cool. Just not the whole debate. There were two speeches, just the P1 and the O1, that it'll be useful to watch those speeches. Okay, so I'm going to keep going, and I'm asking the question because if you did watch these two speeches, maybe you can just write in the chat at some point in the next 10, 15 minutes what score you gave the prop one and the op one. If you didn't watch it, it's fine, like obviously. But I think it's useful to get a sense of what a really good speech looks like and what is an appropriate score for those kinds of speeches. And then you apply that standard consistently. That gives a good standardization of speaker scores and helps speakers a lot. So, okay. In general, though, this is just to highlight the point that you can refer to other debates and other speaker scores to get a sense of these things. But we want judges to use the full range of speaker scores. So here, this is basically what the WSDC briefing has as their general range of speaker scores. But the WSDC speaker rank scores are different. They go from 60 to 80. I have adjusted these on a not rough per se, but definitely, there should be some 0.5s in here, which I wasn't so careful about. But these are the general guidelines you should be following as to how much you should give speeches. And we start from the top, right? Which is that it is possible to get an 81. It is possible to get an 80. You should probably not be giving 81s and 80s. But if you genuinely believe that this is like the best debate speech that's ever been given in a school competition, even you as a judge cannot think of any satisfactory responses to any of the arguments. So the arguments are like flawless, compelling, and most importantly, have incredible style, which means that the presentation of the argument makes it incredibly clear and compelling. Then you can give them an 81. That's reasonable. You can give them an 80. 78s are like arguments that are clearly relevant, engage with the most important issues, no logical, like major logical gaps, a lot of good explanation, sophisticated and nuanced analysis in much of the speech. The arguments are difficult to attack, easy to follow, which means good style also. Here it says on occasion. I would say for a 78, maybe the style should consistently be good enough that the speech is engaging and persuasive. If it meets all of these bars, you can give a 78. 76 to 77, I mean, you can read through all of these points. Easy to follow, good argumentation, relevant, address the core issues, no major logical gaps, so on and so forth. We want judges to use the full range of speaker scores, and this includes low speaker scores. You can be maybe on the side of a higher speaker score. That'll be probably better for the individual speaker. But if you generally think a speech was missed all of the main points, the claims are like marginally relevant, not very good style, so on and so forth, then go ahead, give them a 72. Like, this is fine. Okay. So I think I've repeated myself a few times here, but we use the full range, and that'll probably be a good thing. And apply the standard consistently. This is probably more important. If all judges apply the standard consistently, we'll get pretty good distributions of speaker scores, and people who deserve higher speaker scores will get higher speaker scores consistently, and this is important. Okay, finally, oral adjudication and reasons for decision. This is something that I think is probably most important in this briefing, because we want debaters to improve, right, as judges. And I mean, I know there are debaters in this room as well, but from the perspective of a judge, we want debaters to improve. This is why we give feedback. This is why we give them a decision or reason for decision at all. The easiest way for debaters to improve is to be able to identify patterns between judgments and between reasons for decisions. So if they get a consistent format of an OA across all their debates, across all the judges who judge them, they will be able to see very consistently the pattern of how OAs are constructed, and therefore what they should be doing to improve. And for example, the judge consistently says, oh, you lost this clash because of this reason, and 5 judges tell them that in a row, then it's a consistent reason for them to improve on this, and something that they're confident in, or that they should improve on, that they know matters in the debate, so on and so forth. So you want to have judges kind of following a more or less consistent way of organizing the reason for the decision. The first step of that is being very rigorous in the logic of the decision and the justification. And the more specific the justification, and the justification should always be comparative, the better. So, as we referenced earlier, if two teams both have an engaging argument and there's a strong clash about this particular issue. So again, simple example of you ban fast food, people are free to do what they want, but it's unhealthy for them. Okay. Strong clash of whether or not it is justified to take things away from people based on whether it's bad for them or not. Like, do they have the choice? So you do the comparison. So all claims are made relative to what the other side has said in regards to this issue. This is what they said. This is what the other side said. So therefore, this is the question that needs to be answered for either team to win this clash. Given then that this is the more specific question, the prop or the op team gave me another reason or another piece of rebuttal or another piece of analysis, which is the tipping point for why this clash falls one way or the other. So you're being very specific now. There's a particular reason, given what has been said, acknowledging what the other team has said, that one team wins this over the other team, even though the other team has said XYZ. So that is a specific justification. That is far better than saying, they gave me this argument, I found this more persuasive. Or they gave me this argument, you gave me this argument. I think this argument was better constructed or more well-reasoned. This is still fair. This is how you should be judging. But the justification in the oral adjudication and the reason for decision should refer to more specific things. Why was it better reasoned? What exactly did they say that was, in comparison to the other side, a better reason? So if you can construct your reason for decision in this way, clash, specific question that needs to be answered, specific justification as to why it falls to one side or the other, even like flagging when you had to intervene in a reasonable manner. If you can do all this as a judge and be very specific and rigorous in your justification, this is excellent. This is like the best way that a team can understand when and where and how exactly they lost in a debate, and therefore what they need to improve on. You generally also want to be spending time referring to content, style, and strategy when you are explaining these clashes. So you say this is the clash, and when you say this is what one team has said and this is what the other team has said, we thought the content was reasonable. We thought the analysis was persuasive. We think that the style, for example, was very good. And you should always be referring to style as well. So the presentation was compelling. We understood this from the argument. We understood the implications because of the style, because of the presentation, because of the use of examples, all of this stuff. So the argument was good. Where one team was probably better than the other team was in terms of strategy, because they identified that this is the critical logical question and they decided to address that. And they create a priority to this, and therefore they win this clash. And so on strategy, this team has won, and therefore they win the clash, and therefore they win the debate. So again, you want to refer back to content, style, and strategy when you are deciding, or when you're giving your RFD, to explicitly make it extremely explicit where the team should be improving on. And this goes back to what we said about reply speeches as well. You don't want to be spending the reply speech coming up with this stuff. Reply speech can really help you decide all this stuff if it's done well. Even if it's not done well, you have like the 15 minutes deliberation time to come up with all this stuff yourself. You should not necessarily be spending that deliberation time, especially if it's with other judges, covering the content of the debate. You can make the assumption that all judges have covered the content of the debate, have written it down, have tracked it, whatever. The deliberation, especially if it's a closed debate with a multi-judge panel, should look more like, okay, I think this was the clash. I think this is what it boiled down to. I think this is the tipping point. And I think the strategy or the content or the style of this particular speaker or speech was, for me, where the clash was won or lost. This is a much more productive discussion because it gives a far better RFD at the end for whoever's giving the RFD. And you should be focusing on this stuff. That's probably a better use of your time than, okay, what exactly was said in the debate. Of course, this is a question as well that should be asked, especially if it's unclear what the speaker meant, for example. But as long as what the speakers said was clear, the deliberation should probably look more like what exactly are going to be the elements of the RFD and what are the justifications, how specific can we make the justifications for the RFD? And this probably makes for the best oral adjudication, which is consistent across the board. Okay. Did anyone put, okay. So I think that's it actually. Let me see. Oh, okay, there's some guidelines that I missed. Oh, it's the same thing I said, but judge announce the results first. Yeah, use the three categories, focus on issues, which are important, comparative. Yes, judges should spend an equal amount of time on both teams, balance positive and critical comments, keep it short, at most 10 minutes, and tell teams their approach for individual feedback. The last few points is mostly, these are school competitions, these are school kids. We want to encourage improvement, and we don't want to make it seem like we're favoring one side over the other. Even if you didn't do that, saying, okay, 9 minutes of my adjudication is going to be about why this team won, and 1 minute is about why your team lost, seems a bit unfair. So you don't want to be doing that. When you're talking about content, were the arguments well explained? Were they merely stating a consequence, was explaining? Strategy, yeah, things like too much or too little time in prioritization. All of these can be specific reasons as to why their strategy or their content or their style was not as good as the other teams, again, in comparison. Yeah, there's a link here, which I will just like drop in the chat, to the full WSDC briefing, which is a lot more specific on all this stuff. And you can go and look at that. It's the 2023 one, it's not the 2024 one, but it's basically the same thing. And I think that's about it. Let's go quickly back to scoring speeches and talk a little bit about the prop one and the op one from that semifinal that I referenced earlier. So I'll open the floor now and stop my sharing. And if anyone has specific questions, or if anybody watched those two speeches and, had a particular score for them, then feel free to share it now. Somebody did have some questions that they sent to me. But yeah, any questions? Yes, Chavika.
Yeah, my question is, if a team gives content that isn't really relevant to a motion, let's say arguments about the future in a retrospective motion, but their opponents don't actually point it out as irrelevant, how then do we credit that content?
Okay, that's a good question, maybe a bit specific. So I'm assuming you mean like a this house regrets or this house supports kind of motion, and the team makes an argument that if you as a judge cannot see why it's important to the debate and the other side does not point out that it's not important to the debate, then how do you credit that? So a couple of things. First of all, the team that's making the argument needs to also show relevance of the argument. Sometimes they don't need to do that explicitly because it's immediately obvious. So if it's, we regret social media, and the argument is made that social media leads to like addiction tendencies, this is relevant and it's obviously relevant. If it's you regret social media because in the absence of social media, something better would have come up, it's not so obvious whether this something would have been better and therefore is irrelevant to the debate. The team has the burden to tell you why it's relevant. If they do not tell you why it's relevant, you can discredit the argument. because they haven't explained why it's important in the debate, even if the other team doesn't point it out. If they have made some attempt to show you why it's relevant, but the attempt makes no sense, then the other team should point it out. If both of these happen at the same time, where one team has said something that makes absolutely no sense, and they say therefore it matters in this debate, and the other team just completely ignores it, it really depends on what the justification for including that in the case was, or what the link for the relevance was. If they've made it relevant somehow, it makes some sense, assuming no one objects to it, then you credit it, and maybe you point out that it shouldn't matter in the debate, but somehow it did. And given what was said in the debate, it makes some sense. If it is pointed out, if it is pointed out even marginally by like one line that this makes no sense, and you as a judge believe that this is the case, then yeah, you will discredit it completely. So it depends on how the team is trying to make it relevant. They need to give a justification. If the justification makes no sense, but they have made some link that should make no sense, if somebody points out the obvious problem with it, but then nobody does point out the obvious problem with it, then you can credit it. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. Okay. Any other questions before we talk about those particular speeches? Okay. I'll give you a few minutes to think about the questions, and then we can talk about the two speeches that I referenced earlier. So those are the Prop 1 and Op 1 of Canada versus Singapore in WSDC semifinal, I think 2021. And it was about pharmaceutical companies. So what I would encourage judges to do, and even speakers, is to watch both of those first speeches and get an idea of how they would score those speakers. And it would have been more useful if you watched it beforehand, because then you can compare to what I'm going to say now. But this is still probably useful. This was the same set of speeches that was given this year to all WSDC judges, and we were asked to score accordingly. And the general consensus is that the Prop 1 is probably one of the best WSDC speeches that's ever been given. I gave it a 75, which is different in the WSDC scale. That's probably like a 78, 78.5 in the Asian parliamentary scale. And nothing lower than that would have been reasonable. Like, I think I was on the lowest end of speaker scores there. Very, very good judges that I know gave that speech like a 77, which in Asian parliamentary standard is like at least a 79, 79.5, maybe even, 79.5, I would say. So again, it is all right to give those kinds of scores. And the fact that I only gave it a 75 was probably not like, it didn't reflect very well. Like 75 was reasonable, but it would have been better if I gave it a 76, basically. The Op 1, I gave a 73.5, which is still a very good speech. Maybe something like a 77.5. Yeah, in Asian parliamentary. But again, I think most very good judges who are more familiar with WSDC speaking scale gave it slightly higher, maybe 74, 74.5. So again, these are reasonable scores, like 75, 73.5 are perfectly reasonable, but it's also reasonable to give slightly higher. And those are definitely on the lower end of the scores that should be given. So if you watch those speeches and you decide, I would have given the speech like a 77, maybe you should reevaluate your standards for speeches. Or it's not necessarily that you have a bad way of scoring speeches. Maybe it's just the fact that we are not used to scoring very high, or having like a big difference between speeches in the same debate. So that'll be useful. One thing I forgot to mention is that sometimes when you're scoring and there are like big differences between teams, you can give like a 78, a 77.5, and then the other team you give like 75, 74, you will end up with big margins. You should not be necessarily using the reply speech to adjust those margins. You can, but it's not something that we recommend. Like the reply speech adjustment thing is like something that should be done in very close debates where you think all the speakers gave like equally good speeches. You think logically one team won, so I'm going to give 0.5 or 1 point margin at the reply. To like lower the margin between two teams, given that there's a huge gap between them, I would not use the reply to kind of manipulate the points. If it's a huge margin, let it be a huge margin. Like this is fine. You'll regularly see like 10 plus point margins at WSDC. This is perfectly reasonable. So, but also you're unlikely to see like huge margins very often because of power pairing. But in the instance where you do, that's fine. Okay, so I think I'm done with everything I wanted to say. If there's any other questions, I will hang around for like 5 minutes because we started like 55 minutes ago. So yeah, feel free to ask anything that pops into your head.
Okay, Shalem, nobody seems to have any questions, so I guess we can wrap up. Again, thank you for conducting the workshop. And everybody else, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Best of luck.
See you.